Welcome to our Black History, Women's History Month event celebrating Smith College President Emeritus Ruth Simmons' memoir, Up Home, One Girl's Journey, which was published in September 2023 by Random House to great acclaim. My name is Aaron Kamgisha. I'm the Ruth Simmons Professor of Africana Studies.
And I'm Candelario. I'm a professor of sociology, Latin American Latino studies, and the editor of Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism.
We are grateful for the co-sponsorship of the Study of Women and Gender program, Africana Studies, the French Department, and Alumni Relations. Thanks also to Ali Ebenbinder, Editorial Office Manager of Meridians, David Osipowicz, an Academic Assistant for Africana Studies, Kat Dolan in the President's Office, Media Services, especially Jeff Heath, all of whom have provided invaluable behind-the-scenes support that makes an event of this scope look easy, and the Alumni Relations team, especially Lindsay McGrath, for making this event available to the worldwide Smith community. I understand that there are over 500 alumni registered as of today, so we want to acknowledge your presence. Thank you very much for being here with us. We would also like to give a special welcome to President Simmons' son, Carrie Cabral Simmons, who is joining us here today. And finally, thank you to President Sarah Willie LeBreton for immediately and enthusiastically accepting our invitation to welcome our esteemed guest, President Emerita Ruth J. Simmons, and to reintroduce her to the Smith College community.
Before turning the event over to President Sarah, please allow us to offer you a brief overview of the program. President Sarah will introduce President Simmons. President Simmons will read a selection from her memoir, Up Home, One Girl's Journey.
Up Home brings you from Ruth Simmons' childhood as a daughter of sharecroppers in East Texas, who becomes the first Black president of an Ivy League university. It is an uplifting story of girlhood and the power of family, community, and the classroom to transform one young person's life.
After the reading, I will join President Simmons on stage for a conversation about the book, her work in higher education, her scholarship, and her central role in the founding of Meridians at Smith College. We hope to have about 10 minutes at the end for any questions you might have, those of you who are here in person, and also we've collected questions from the alums who have registered for the webinar.
And then I will return to the stage to close out the event at 6 p.m. and to invite you to purchase the pre-signed copies of Up Home, which are being sold by Northampton-based Broadside Books just outside this room. And now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage President Sarah Willie LeBreton.
Thank you, Aaron and Ginetta. And Aaron, again, I'm so thrilled that you are the inaugural Ruth J. Simmons Chair of Africana Studies. Everyone, I am so pleased to welcome all of you this afternoon. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing President Emerita of Smith College, Ruth Simmons, as we celebrate her enduring legacy at Smith and her new memoir. After completing her PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard, Dr. Simmons served in various faculty and administrative roles at the University of Southern California, Princeton University, and Spelman College before becoming president of Smith College in 1995. While at Smith, she oversaw the hiring of an historic number of faculty of color who are now senior faculty here, and who serve the college in a wide variety of leadership positions. She launched a number of important academic initiatives, including our engineering program, the first four-year Bachelor of Science program at an American women's college, the Poetry Center, and she supported the founding of the journal Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, which published its first issue in the fall of 2000. Dr. Simmons left Smith to become president of Brown University, where she was the first Black woman to lead an Ivy League school, and which, under her leadership, made significant strides in improving its standing as one of the world's finest research universities. While there, she also held appointments as a professor in the departments of comparative literature and Africana studies. She retired from Brown and returned to her home state of Texas, but was soon called to serve as the president of Prairie View A&M University, located in Houston. She served as the first female president of Prairie View until just last year, and under her leadership, Prairie View was reclassified as an R2 research university. Dr. Simmons is the recipient of many honors, including a Fulbright Fellowship to France, the President's Award from the United Negro College Fund, the Fulbright Lifetime Achievement Medal, the Eleanor Roosevelt Val-Kill Medal, the Foreign Policy Association Medal, the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, and the Centennial Medal from Harvard University. Dr. Simmons is a member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the Council on Foreign Relations, and serves on the board of the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Holdsworth Center for Leadership in Public Education. She also serves on the board of directors of the financial and marketing services company Square. Awarded numerous honorary degrees, she received the Brown faculty's highest honor, the Susan Culver Rosenberger Medal, and was named a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. And perhaps most significance for this community, received an honorary degree from Smith in 2014. Most recently, on February 21st, Dr. Simmons joined the LBJ School as its Barbara Jordan Forum keynote speaker and received the Barbara Jordan Public Service Award, which honors a trailblazer and leader who represents Barbara Jordan's voice, legacy, and unwavering commitment to building community through activism and public service. Currently, Dr. Simmons is a distinguished presidential fellow at Rice University and advisor to the president of Harvard University on HBCU initiatives. I have followed her career since I earned my doctorate in 1995, watching her unequivocal and yet strategic leadership inspire legions of faculty, students, and staff. Please join me in welcoming the inestimable Dr. Ruth Simmons.
That's why I keep him around. Thank you, son. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and to know of the work that you're doing here. One always worries about the future when you lead an institution. And I'm back today and I see all the good works that you're all doing here. And I'm immensely, immensely proud of being associated with this stellar institution. So thank you. I'm going to read from chapter 2 of my memoir, Up Home. One of my earliest memories is of my mother sobbing as she read a letter from my brother Wilford. Wilford, Mama's third child, left home in 1947 to join my oldest brother Albert and seek work in Houston. He found a job initially as a day laborer, but enlisted in the Army in 1948 for a 3-year tour of duty. His motivation for enlisting was to earn steady pay that he could send to my parents in Grapeland. Even at a young age, Wilford was family-centered, loyal, obedient, and generous. Generosity in the ubiquitously impoverished world we knew marked him as unusual. His good nature, however, made him the object of teasing and bullying by family members and peers. Identified early on as Mama's favorite, he enjoyed her protection as well as that of my older sisters and brothers when they saw others outside the family bullying him. Quick to cry in deep, mournful howls, he remained the butt of derision for much of his time in Grapeland and even beyond, but he was deeply loved and respected. by everyone in the family. The sight of my mother sobbing aroused in me the deepest feelings of uncertainty and insecurity. I searched her face to understand what she was feeling. She stood on the creaky, leaning front porch of our paint-starved house as she continued to look down at the letter. I eventually understood that Wilford's letter had brought news of his deployment to Korea. Too young to understand the implications of this conflict in a distant country, I cared only that this news had brought Mama, the strongest person I knew, to tears. In the months that followed that moment when I saw Mama crying, I frequently thought about how my life might change unexpectedly. And over the next months, I started to pepper my mother with questions. Would she and Daddy always be there? Would my other sisters and brothers leave as Wilford, Chester, and Elbert had done? Would I see them again? Would I ever die? As a contented child, I had been immune to anxiety. Yet on the day that I began to understand Mama's fears for her children, my worries commenced, and they remained with me for most of my youth. Much later, I came to understand better the true nature of my mother's strength, but images of her vulnerability dominated these childhood years. My mother has remained somewhat of a puzzle to me. What must it have meant to be born Fannie Eula Campbell in 1906 in East Texas? She spoke of her parents as the dominant influence of her life. Their story bespeaks the values she imparted to her own children. Richard Campbell and Emma Johnson were rooted in what they had experienced from slave parents. Emma, up to her death in 1947, followed many of the practices and habits her family had acquired and preserved during slavery. She dressed like a slave for all of her 75 years, wearing long dresses made of bleached cotton canvas with an African headdress of similar fabric. She wore plain white cotton dresses during the week and striped cotton dresses on Sundays. Like most at that time, Mama Emma, which we elided to Mom Emma, had only one pair of shoes, black high-top work boots with laces. She was not a large woman, but her heavy petticoats gave the impression that her slight figure was bulkier. In spite of her diminutive size, people invariably remarked on her strength, especially her ability to carry large, heavy loads on her head after the style of African women. She frequently carried water from the well with a full bucket on her head and one in each hand. Emma had an unusual way of expressing herself. "Thee better get thee biscuit on that stump," she would say to grandchildren who misbehaved. A woman of imposing and some would say fierce mien, she was also a memorable disciplinarian. She would direct the miscreants to a small tree stump that provided child-sized seating on her front porch. She and my grandfather Richard must have struck quite a picture together. She, with jet black skin, wearing stark white clothing and a headdress, and he, tall, handsome, and extremely fair. When Richard died, the land he and Doc had purchased provided the only means for Mom Emma to take care of and protect her family. Emma eventually remarried, but her new husband declined to work in the fields. Emma, who couldn't bear to see her children laboring while their stepfather did nothing, confronted him. "The children are in the fields, and thee is in the house sleeping. Get thee things and get out," she ordered. She never married again. Keeping the homestead going with animals to tend and fields to plant was a challenge. Her 3 daughters and son were responsible for much of the labor. One daughter, Jim, had died in early adulthood, and a son, Richard, had been shot in the kneecap at the age of 16 while hunting with a cousin and did not survive. Emma managed to see the remaining children live to adulthood. When they married and had families, they settled not far from the Campbell homestead, and Emma's grandchildren became fixtures in her house. Too young when she died, I did not have the pleasure of being consigned to her tree stump for misbehaving. Richard Campbell's patrician and loving nature and Mom Emma's strength and independence helped mold my mother's spirit. Mama was quiet, reflective, kind, generous, and forgiving. The turmoil of a 12-child household did not seem to faze her, nor did the need to rise at 4 a.m. to prepare for a day of cooking, cleaning, and working in the fields. I often thought that she settled for too little in her life. She voiced no complaints except those pertaining to our misbehavior. She cared little for her appearance and seemed satisfied to comb her hair or fix her braids without fuss, and to wear crude and sometimes tattered dresses that no vain woman would don. Deeply religious and attentive to following the Bible's teachings, Mama saw her life as having a specific purpose. Of overriding importance was seeing her children taught the right values and ensuring that they lived to adulthood. But her life was to be considerably more complicated than these simple goals she set for herself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Simmons, for that reading and for joining us again today. Before we begin, I want to thank you for the work you did as president of the college, without which I have often said, I'm fairly certain I would not have been hired onto the faculty at Smith, nor would Meridians, the Women of Color feminist journal I now have the privilege of editing, have been founded 24 years ago, in addition to the many other transformative projects and initiatives that you seeded that have bloomed and blossomed over the past 25 years. So as you know from our earlier conversations, I've been studying up on your biography, reading interviews, essays, and even a dissertation that was written about you, as well as watching broadcasts such as Finding Your Roots episode, season 1, episode 7, in case anyone wants to watch it, and the 60 Minutes interview with you, in which you share some of the details about your family's story, as well as your own educational and professional experiences. However, few interviewers ask you about your scholarship, even as they note that you took your PhD from Harvard in French languages, literatures, and cultures, where you were also introduced by Dr. Mercer Cook to the Negritude movement's origins in Francophone Africa and the Caribbean, and especially the work of Martinican Aimé Césaire and Senegalese Léopold Senghor. You also undertook a study of the educational system of Haiti in 1985 while you were on the faculty at Princeton. So I'd like to begin our conversation by asking you to speak to how your formation and contributions as a scholar of Black Francophone movements, societies, literatures, and cultures influenced or intersected with your work as an academic leader.
Thank you. And thank you again so dearly for having me and for your care of Meridians, such an important project. I'm very proud of the fact that it is housed here and nurtured here at Smith as it should be. Well, as I told you earlier, I think when I was studying, people thought of me as an oddity because it seemed rather far-fetched for someone from Fifth Ward in Houston, Texas, to study French. And so they raise questions all the time about how meaningful, or rather how meaningless that was in the context of the turmoil of the civil rights struggle. But because Mercer Cook did come to Harvard as a visiting professor when I was a student there, and I was introduced to the world of Francophone literature of Africa and the Caribbean, my life changed. And I came to have examples of how I could exist in the cultural environment of the country that I live in. And so, as you may know, Césaire and Senghor undertook to shape an expression that was unique to their cultures. They asserted they were entitled to do that, and that they would not be a mere imitation of French language and culture. They would shape their own culture while using the French language. And I just thought that was so brilliant. Both men were quite acclaimed as authors, but Césaire struck me particularly as a magnificent human being. And so I wanted to study him in particular because he was had an aggressive style of writing about his homeland, changing the language in such a visceral way, asserting powerfully that I can speak about my culture and about my country in my own voice in a way that is unique. And so I went to Martinique to meet him and to interview him. And I would say that that was an amazing moment for me because you see, he was real. He was a human being that I met. And so the idea that people like him could exist, because I'd read Montaigne and Du Bellay and all of those people who tried to shape the French language in a unique way. But he was a man in front of me who was doing this. And as a consequence of that, I started thinking about what we could do in this country to shape a unique language, a unique expression, and to assert our place in this very diverse environment where we live. And that led me over time to really take an interest in building departments of women's studies, of African-American and Latino studies and so forth, to emphasize how vital it is to a people to own their culture and their language and to be able to express themselves fully in it. And that's really what it caused me to become a university president, because I took on the building the Afro-American Studies program at Princeton with some success. And as a consequence, I gained a profile of building programs. And that's what led me into a presidency. So that really, so my academic work and my scholarship at the point where I began to think that I needed to fix universities, took a back seat. And yes, I was that crazy. I thought I had an obligation to try to make these places better. And so my teaching took a back seat to that, and I was busy trying to reshape what universities could be. But it was all from the influence of my studies that caused me to do that.
So you were sharing with us earlier about the story of how you went about speaking with your colleagues, both your faculty colleagues and administrators at Princeton, about not only the need, but the fact that there was ample ground for establishing an Afro-American Studies program. Could you share that story with the audience today around the process that you undertook with your legal pads and how you said about creating the evidence?
Well, there are certain proof points that are undeniably important. At Princeton at the time, I would say the university leadership didn't think much of Afro-American studies. It was not supported well at all. And so there was no investment in it. So they came to me and asked me if I would lead Afro-American studies. And of course I said no, I absolutely would not. They asked why. I said, because you obviously do not care about Afro-American studies if you want to put a French professor there to lead it when they know nothing about Afro-American studies. And so the very fact that you don't care is enough for me to say no. But they called me back and said, okay, well, Ruth, we need a black face. And so would you tell us what it would take for you to do this? And so I said, the 8 things I need. And I ran down the list, and after each one, they said, done. They were pretty desperate. But the one thing that I knew, which I think is so important for people to understand, is that, of course, expertise is very important, but sometimes just caring is important too. And I knew that of all the people there, I cared most about Afro-American studies, although I knew nothing about it. And so I got busy. I got a legal pad and I wrote down the names of scholars who could really teach Princeton a lesson if they were appointed there. Okay, because Princeton didn't understand how extraordinary it would be to have great scholars like these in the mix. So I wanted to show them that. And so I just went down the list, recruiting faculty. And the first faculty member that I recruited was Toni Morrison. And when Toni came, right after she joined the faculty, she won the Pulitzer and then, of course, the Nobel Prize. And it was like a light was turned on at that moment when she won the Nobel Prize. It was a funny story. That morning, I was watching the news and they said, Toni Morrison has won the Nobel Prize. And of course, I screamed first. And then I called her and I said, Toni, why didn't you tell me? And she was very annoyed. It was early in the morning. And she said, tell you what? I said, why didn't you tell me that you had won the Nobel Prize? She said, but I haven't won the Nobel Prize.
I haven't gotten the call yet.
I said, but you have because they announced it on television. She said, don't you think if I had won the Nobel Prize, I would know? Anyway,
Like, check the voicemail. Right.
but they called her later. But what a transformation. Suddenly, Princeton started owning the fact that they had Toni Morrison and that she was a Nobel Prize laureate. The president of Princeton went over for the ceremony and so forth. It was so sometimes just showing people is much better than haranguing them. Although I didn't fall short in haranguing people either, but that was an important moment. And after that, it was considerably easier to make appointments across the university, including appointments of women. On the question of women, I was incensed. I was incensed about a lot. I was incensed about the fact that there were so few women faculty at Princeton, and in particular in engineering and in math. Math said there was no woman in the world who was qualified to be appointed to the math faculty, and they sealed that by having no women's restrooms in the math building. And so I thought, well, something's got to be done because we have all these women at Princeton now, and they have no faculty, women faculty. And so I decided to take matters in hand and to write a white paper about this. And of course, in typical fashion, I wrote the paper. And that next morning, I walked into the president's office and the provost's office and gave them a copy of my white paper and said, here, I'd like for you to read this. and they did. The next day, I was called in by the provost who said, we read your white paper. I said, well, very good. And then I was turning to leave and this was Neil Rutenstein. And he said, and we agree, so go do it. Okay. So they gave me a fund to fund faculty positions to appoint women in engineering and in math. And in a single year, I went to math and said, I know there are no women qualified to be appointed in math, but if you find any, no matter how many, I will give you the positions to hire them, and you don't have to use any of your positions for it. And they came back with 6 proposals. So again, sometimes you just want to show people that, you know, what sometimes they truly don't understand what the issue is. Well, yes, if it's free, I'll appoint a woman. But if I have to use a priceless slot that could very well go to a man, I don't want to do that. And so sometimes you have to find ways to expose the reason that people are engaged in that kind of behavior. But again, all of this is largely from the kinds of things that I learned reading 16th century and 17th, 18th century literature. And I just feel so strongly that the humanities can fuel a lot of interesting approaches, that we don't have to be studying only technical fields. So I'm really trying to encourage people to read more in the humanities.
And in the humanistic social sciences, that comes across in so many of the interviews and essays that you've written about these questions. You also mentioned in one of the interviews that a couple of things. One is that you did your junior year as an undergraduate at Wellesley, and also that while you were at Princeton, you did a 2-year, I think, visiting professorship at Spelman College. So transitioning into your arrival at Smith, how did those experiences at these other women's colleges prepare you to come to Smith, if at all? Or what was that interaction like?
Well, first of all, you know, I'm a product of my the way that I grew up, frankly. It was very clear, made very clear to me when I was a child that I was not to be ambitious, that I was not to outdo boys in any way, that I needed to be subservient in, you know, in every respect. And it was very hard to grow out of that, frankly, because that continued, and it was ratified in the Black community largely through churches and through the civil rights struggle, where women's voices were muted in favor of showing strong Black men. And so I'm a product of that time. And really, when I went to Wellesley, that was the first time I encountered the idea of women doing everything that men do. And so the moment that I saw Margaret Clapp, president of Wellesley, yeah, she was serving tea, but still, she was running a university. She had been an ambassador, this woman. And I thought, gee, this
was in the 60s, correct? Or 50s?
Well, yes, that was in 65. And my goodness, the idea of, and of course, the whole campus where women were empowered to do things and not take a back seat to anyone. So that had a profound impact on me, I would say, definitely. And when I left Princeton, I was on a track that was pretty promising, I would say, at Princeton. But I decided, well, wow, this is a very elite institution, but why don't I take what I've learned and go someplace where I can be really helpful? And I decided to go to Spelman. And I didn't go as a visiting faculty member. I went as provost at Spelman. And that was a very important moment for me because, you know, in some ways, I learned a lot more at Spelman because I couldn't get away with the same things that I got away with at Princeton. At Princeton, I was this mad Black woman, right? Constantly complaining about things and then pressing the university to do certain things. But at Spelman, I was the chief academic officer. And here I was coming from Princeton to tell these Black people what they should do. Well, you see the dynamic already. And so I made a lot of mistakes when I went to Spelman in trying to bring things from Princeton that were particular to Princeton to Spelman. And I learned my lesson that was not suitable for Spelman. But we did some very good and important work there. But I had to learn that every environment is different, and not to try to import ideas from places like Princeton, wherever you go. And so those experiences were very valuable in really my preparation to become a president, because I learned to listen. Listening is so hard when you think you have all the answers. It's really difficult, and that's the way I was. And so that experience at Spelman really put me on a course to be more generous with my work, and to let other people into the process of shaping programs and solving problems and so forth. And I really think that helped me immensely become, a much better person. And so from Princeton, I went back to Princeton, and from that experience, I was then looked at to become college president.
So could you share the story of how that came to pass, that you agreed to consider the presidency at Smith? And then I want to ask you another question about Spelman and the Smith connection, but we'll get back to that.
Well, I had come to believe that I was a bit of a pariah, and that because of all of my hectoring people and being so unpleasant for so many years, that would live with me forever. And I thought I would, frankly, I wasn't suitable to be an upper level administrator or leader of a college or university. There was a wonderful man who was, two men at Princeton who were very instrumental in my development. One was Aaron Lemonick, who was a terrifying man. But he was probably the first person in my career who was honest with me. He gave me criticism that wounded me deeply at the time. But of course, I now know that he paved the way for me to become the leader that I became by being honest with me. Also, I recognized afterwards that he respected me enough to be honest with me. So I always tell my students, get away from those faculty who are praising you and saying how wonderful you are. Find the faculty who are willing to be honest with you and respect who you are. And so the second person was the president, Harold Shapiro. And for some reason, Harold Shapiro just decided that I was on my way to a presidency. I didn't believe it, but he did. And so he had a way of providing ways for me to learn things. And I didn't understand what was going on, but it was very helpful. So one day, I was contacted by the Smith board and asked if I would be willing to be considered for the Smith presidency. And of course I said, no, I would not, because honestly, I thought it would be a sham search. In those days, people would include Blacks in searches, and they had no intention of appointing a Black person. as a president. And to that point, there had never been a Black person really appointed to a similar kind of institution. And therefore, I thought that they were being dishonest with me. So I said, no, I wouldn't participate in a sham. But they kept at it and convinced me that they were serious. And so I went for an interview. And after the interview, they told me that they were focusing on me, and they were going to do a background check, and so on, which I was offended by that, because I thought, well, are you doing background checks for everybody, or are you just doing it for me because I'm Black? I mean, what's that all about? And but in any case, they did it. And then they finished their process and invited me to become president, but I still wasn't satisfied. And so I had to have a heart-to-heart talk with the board, and say, you know, I can't be your person. I only know how to be one person, and that's me. That's who I am, with everything that I am. And if you want someone who can be, follow in the tradition of Smith women, being very poised and cultured and social and all of those good things, that's not who I am.
Many of us would disagree with that assessment. But
Well, I say that that's not who I am. And so, but they said, no, we understand who you are. They didn't, that we understand who you are. And so we sealed the deal, and I agreed to come. But I was terrified. Until that point, nobody really knew who I was, I would say, because I was very proud of being a private person. And I was very suspicious of people who needed to know everything about me. Why? Why do all you need to do is see my work, and apprehend my intelligence. That's all you need. Why do you need the rest of it? And so I had not disclosed an awful lot about my background at that point. And when the announcement of my appointment was made, and the articles came out about my appointment at Smith, then all of the details came out about my being from Fifth Ward, having grown up poor, having a family of sharecroppers and so forth. That was the first time anybody really knew that story. And I didn't realize that it was valuable for people to know who I was. But after that, and after the mail that I got from people around the country saying, I think I understand that there are things that I can do now. So I always say to people, it's very important for each of us to disclose who we are in full, because somehow I never imagined that that would inspire anybody or be meaningful to people. And I was so wrong about it. So I'm glad it finally came out. And I think the relationship that I've enjoyed with my students over the years has been principally because they have those details about my life.
Well, that's a wonderful way to segue into a question about the actual memoir. Because one of the things that, again, that I noticed in reading the interviews and listening to the interviews is that you do share bits and pieces of your story at the point that you are writing about these things when you're president of Smith and are now in national prominence in these ways, and subsequently of Brown. You share the stories about your mom, you mentioned Grapeland and so forth. But really, it's not until the memoir that you offer us the fuller account. And actually, one of my students in a class that I'm teaching sent along a lovely question, and I'll paraphrase it for her. But it's basically about one of the most challenging things about writing a memoir is that balance between revealing aspects of one's story, and by extension, our families and our communities and the other players in our live story, and preserving privacy or discretion. And that is such a difficult line to walk. So as a memoirist now, I was wondering if you could speak with us a little bit about that the challenge of both revelation of self, because it does provide inspiration. It is a role model. You are a first in so many ways, including in your own family. And so many of us are inspired and need that. On the other hand, not every reader, not every listener is going to be supportive or generous, right, with us. So how has that been for you, Dr. Simmons, that balance between revealing and preserving?
Well, certainly, when I decided to write it, I had to determine whether or not I could do it truthfully and fully. I knew beforehand that I would not complete it if I couldn't do that. So one of the things that's most important, I think, for me, and goes back to my mother, certainly, was for every part of my character and my life and my actions to be attuned to the truth of what I believe and who I am. And I struggled for a while with whether or not I could actually write it because I didn't know whether or not I could be fully truthful, given the fact that it would be harmful in some instances to people if I did that. But I had a choice. This is not the book people wanted from me. The book people want from me is the inside story of higher education. That's what they want from me. And then I knew for sure that telling those stories would be very explosive. And therefore, I was very reluctant to start there. And so I wanted to start with myself and whether or not I had the courage to do that fully. So I think in writing a memoir, you have to make that decision first. How fulsome are you willing to be with who you are? And if you're not, you probably shouldn't write it because people will be able to see through that. But there were very definitely parts of the book that were very hard to write. I didn't know, for example, whether I would be able to write anything about my mother, because my mother died when I was 15. I have mourned her death for every moment of my life since. And for most of that time, I couldn't even speak about it. So, and sometimes now I can't speak about it. So I didn't know if I could write about her in particular, because it would be so difficult to do. And I knew if I wrote about my father, I would have to write the truth about my father. He was a very complicated man who was imprisoned by the circumstances of his time. And but I wanted to tell the truth about him too. So it was a struggle, and I didn't look for a precise balance between the one and the other. I just sat down and tried to communicate as much as I could about what I had lived and how I felt about what I had lived.
So I want to quote something you said in one of your essays. In 1998, while president of Smith College, you published an essay entitled, quote, "My Mother's Daughter, Lessons I Learned in Civility and Authenticity," which was reprinted 10 years later during your presidency at Brown University by the Texas Journal of Ideas, History, and Culture in celebration of Women's History Month. In that beautiful essay, which I recommend highly, by the way, to everyone, you pay homage to how your mother, quote, "showed you how she could, with grace, magnanimity, and aplomb, carry out the most difficult and most unfulfilling work," which one could say about you as well, Dr. Simmons, in terms of the leadership roles that you have played. So many of the questions we got from the alums were asking about your time at Smith. And if you could share with us, reflect with us what you remember most about that time, how your mother's example carried you through some of the difficult moments, perhaps, of being president of Smith. And also this question of civility and authenticity, because that is a perennial question, right? In university spaces and college spaces where debate is at the heart of what we do. So that's a very complicated question, but yeah, any part of that.
Well, first of all, I was beyond happy as Smith's president. First, because the students welcomed me so warmly. Really, I mean, in a world in which, there's often awkwardness between faculty and students, between administration and students. I just couldn't believe how warm and accepting people were of me here at Smith, and that took me a bit by surprise. And in some, there's some silly things that happened here that I always remember as an example of something I wasn't trying to do, but that happened nonetheless. So I was, I'd gone to the faculty club for an event one day, and I was driving back up campus, and I noticed there was a Smith student struggling who was on crutches. She was struggling to get up the hill. And I stopped, of course, and said, get in, I'll take you where you need to go. And then to my horror, she said, President Simmons, no, if you could do what you've done with your challenges, I can certainly get up this hill on crutches. And I thought, well, that's not what I want. That's not what I want people to think. Okay. And so one of the things that I was always struggling with is try to bring that down a notch. Okay. Because I wanted people to see me for who I am and not venerate me to a ridiculous degree. And I didn't want that gap to be so wide. And that's why I always insist that students call me Ruth and not treat me as an iconic individual or as a mythic individual who struggled through all kinds of things and overcame. I mean, that's ridiculous. So, partly I didn't want that because I want them to see that every avenue is open to them to learn, to take advantage of what they encounter, to be open to other people. And that's why I always I always talk to students about sharing who they are with others and communicating across vast differences. Because if you can't do that in college, you're certainly not going to be able to do it after you leave college. And we have a country that is in deep trouble because we still have not learned the fundamental elements of talking to each other respectfully and caring about others different from our group. And so I felt here at Smith that I, for the first time, had a way of taking on the pastoral role and caring for students, trying to uphold certain values to them, and hoping that somehow by doing that, their lives would be more meaningful because I tried to live those values and they could see those values reflected in me. And so that was something that I didn't know I had exactly until I came to Smith. But students were so responsive that I began to learn that in a way that, and the way that they treated me was eventually so comforting, except in one instance when I was trying to raise money for the campus center. And I went out to California to see Mrs. Hewlett of Hewlett Packard. And I thought, well, she has enough money to, pay for a campus center for Smith, and she was a Smith alum. So I invited her to come for a visit. And she was lovely. She came for a visit and she was staying at the president's house. And I was very excited, and we came down and we were at breakfast, and we were chatting, and there was a noise outside. And I thought, well, okay, the doorbell rang, I think. And I decided, okay, well, the doorbell's ringing, and I knew that the staff were busy. So I got up from the table to go to the door. Meanwhile, I saw the staff running toward me, asking me not to open the door. No, don't open the door. But it was too late, because I opened the door and there are these women in various stages of nudity in the yard.
Smith.
Okay,
Mhm.
okay. And then I think, oh dear, Mrs. Hewlett, is here. And so she came out, she heard the noise because the students were cheering or something. And she saw the students in this state, and she laughed, so she thought it was hilarious. And so on. So sometimes there were antics that were a little bit challenging for me to deal with, but otherwise it was, they treated me with such love and respect, and I'm forever grateful for that.
Well, I have to say that as a faculty member who arrived at Smith, as I said, during your presidency, I think that sentiment extended into the faculty, particularly those of us who were part of the newer cohort that you welcomed into the college. And I think I can safely say that because of that, we have helped to transform Smith into the kind of institution that you'd hoped we would become.
Definitely.
As part of that, you were instrumental in the founding of the journal Meridians. This morning, we were able to show you the exhibit that we put up with the 24-year history.
Wonderful.
We're about to come on our 25th anniversary.
And 5 years.
No, it's hard to believe.
Oh my.
So I was hoping you could say a word or two about that, because as I understand the story, a group of my senior colleagues, most of whom are retired now, with the exception of Vicki Spellman, who's joining us here today and is about to retire, approached you with an idea about founding this journal at Smith. So could you say a little bit about that and how it was of a piece, I would argue, with the work you had been doing for decades already around transforming the academy?
Well, certainly, one of the biggest challenges at that time was the fact that scholars couldn't get published. Because perforce, if you wrote about issues of concern to women or to minorities, finding a venue for publishing that work was very, very challenging. So when the idea came for a journal that focused on women of many cultures, but here a journal that was refereed, where scholars could get their work published, I thought it was a brilliant idea, and that it really belonged at a place like Smith. And so I was very happy to support it, and thrilled that we had an opportunity to make an important statement. And that statement was about the way the academy organizes itself to exclude people who may think differently, to exclude ideas that are different, to exclude people who present a different profile. And so I was always trying to tweak that at every opportunity. And so when I was working on the appointment of Toni Morrison, who did not have a PhD, I thought she should have an appointment as a chaired professor in English without a PhD, for example. And when I brought Paula Giddings here without a PhD, because her work stood for what her value was, and nobody had ever seen it. They would only give her temporary appointments up until the moment she came to Smith as a tenured professor. So every time we have an opportunity to show the ways in which we can improve the academy or improve society, we ought to be busy trying to do that. And Meridians was one of those ways of getting in front of people and saying, this is what is missing from the academy.
Absolutely. And it really, it has, I think, transformed the academy in multiple fields of knowledge. And it has played a central role in tenure, because we have hewed to the highest standard of double
Yes.
anonymized peer review, and we're now published by a tier 1 university
Yes.
press and so forth. And your quote from volume 1, number 1, graces almost everything that we put out in the world. Women of color have many histories, and these histories can be brought into full and sharp relief by providing opportunities for these women to speak for themselves. And certainly that is our mission,
For
and
themselves.
to speak for themselves. And that's why your memoir, it's so much a part of that. Let's see. I want to ask you some of the questions that the alumni sent in. One of them was, well, they said over and over again that you were president for many of their 4 years. They felt such great admiration for you. And if you have a favorite memory other than the invasion by the near naked students while you were hosting, or you were hosting Ms. Hewlett.
Oh, goodness. There's so many memorable stories. Good goodness. We brought Ruth Bader Ginsburg here. And why do I always recall the troubling ones? But anyway, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was here for an event, and she was staying at the president's house. And I got up early to go down and make sure she had breakfast and all that sort of thing. And I was down there. She had brought her granddaughter, who was, I think, about 7 years old or so. And I was downstairs and her granddaughter came down and said, "I can't wake grandma." I said, "Oh, don't worry. She's sleeping soundly. Go back upstairs and then put your hand on her shoulder and shake her gently and call her name. And I'm sure she'll wake up." So she went up and she did that. And then she came back and she said, "I still can't wake grandma." Well, now I'm going into full panic mode because I'm saying to myself, Ruth Bader Ginsburg will not die in this house. Okay. I was panicked, absolutely panicked, but I didn't know what to do because with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I couldn't go up there and into the room and say, "Wake up," right? Yeah, I couldn't do that. So I'm just immobilized. So finally I decide I could either stay downstairs and fall apart, or I could be brave enough to go up there and walk in her room, right? And that's what I did. So I said, "Come on, let's go up." So I knocked on the door, no answer. I knocked again, no answer. I opened the door and I walked in. She was in bed. I walked over to her and I touched her and I said, "Justice Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg." And she woke up. I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but your granddaughter was so worried because you didn't wake up when she tried to wake you up." So, I mean, that's, but I remember with great fondness, all the extraordinary people who came here to interact with students, to talk about their lives, and so on. And of course, there's so many famous women associated with Smith and will be forever. That I also remember Barbara Bush and President Bush inviting me to Kennebunkport for a day. And it was in many ways very interesting and strange day. But it was a glorious day, quite beautiful. And in fact, a photograph of me with President and Mrs. Bush on the rocks overlooking the water is on my desk. But the thing is that the unsettling thing was that they were really very Republican, and I'm not. And so we were chatting, and they were probing for my opinion about various things. And doggone it, they asked me about my opinion of Clarence Thomas, and they're very fond of him. Yeah, very fond of him. And didn't I think he was the most marvelous man, and so forth. So I also remember circumstances where I had to really be able to express my views without offense, and really to understand that there were people who saw life differently from me. Okay. And that's an example. There were many examples of people associated with the college who were very different in their views. And I'm now I've just been asked by Neil Bush to serve on the Barbara Bush Foundation, which I have agreed to do, and I'm happy. Her Literacy Foundation. Because I'm working on literacy programs in Texas. So there's so many wonderful events. Mountain Day, oh my goodness. The pressure about when to declare it. Oh. Rose, when is it going to be? And all of that. Oh my goodness. And the traditions. Oh, the traditions, right?
Rally.
Oh, rally day. And oh, wow. I'll never forget that first day that I visited Smith. Because you couldn't visit before you were appointed. So anyway, the first day I visited Smith, and I think I have my speech that I made. I might send it to the library here.
That would be
and the emotion that I felt, coming to campus and talking about why I was here and what I wanted to do here and so on. I remember, of course, the debates about engineering and whether or not it was the right thing to do at a college like Smith, after all, to do engineering. What kind of crazy idea was that? And I remember people's reaction when they said, well, we have no room for engineering here. There's no room. And I said, that's okay. I'll put up a temporary building. So we did. And then, Ford came along and said they wanted to support a permanent building for engineering. So there's so many, oh my goodness, there's so many wonderful stories like that.
And I don't know if you read the news that it was a Smith engineering team of current students and alums and a Smith professor that answered the challenge to come up with a respirator that could be put together during the pandemic.
Yes.
It was the Smith team that won that
Well, of
challenge.
course.
Engineering. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. So
that's what we knew all along, right?
Right. Yeah. So I know we're at Smith and that we should focus mostly on Smith, but I want to ask you also about not only the work you did at Brown, which was also groundbreaking, particularly around the call to confront Brown's legacy and its relationship to the history of enslavement in this country. And then subsequently, you retired for a minute and were called back into service at Prairie View. So could you say a little bit for us about the work you did after Smith and where you are today and the work you're doing today?
I regard it as all of a piece, really. When I got to Brown, this question of institutions involved with the transatlantic slave trade was swirling. And alumni ask, well, what is the true story? Were founders at Brown involved in the transatlantic slave trade? And so I thought, well, that's a fair question, and somehow we should answer it. And so I went to as many places as I could to find out what the answer was. It was all erased and denied by everybody that there was any connection.
And wasn't there that article by David Horowitz, that horrible article that he wrote?
Well, that was the first thing I confronted, the ad. You know, I guess it was enough of a shock for people to have an African-American president of an Ivy League institution, that suddenly everything that had to do with anything Black was had a special challenge for me. But the first thing was that before I even got there, there was an ad in the paper saying that African Americans were lucky to have been enslaved because had they been left in Africa, look what their lives would be. So this wonderful gentleman had put an ad in the newspaper to
David
say
Horowitz.
that. Yeah, and so immediately the students at Brown ran around the campus, picking up all the newspapers and destroying them. And they got into trouble for doing that because you can't do that, right? And so the campus was in a state when I got there about this Horowitz incident. But the Republicans on campus decided they wanted to invite him to campus. And so then the students demanded to know what I was going to do about that. They insisted that the invitation be blocked, that he not come to campus with his heinous views and so forth. And so I said, well, yes, of course, they are heinous views, but universities don't block you know, opposing views. And furthermore, this is a campus organization, and they have asked to have this speaker. And if we don't allow him to speak, when you have your speakers come to campus, shall I then pull the plug on them? So we're going to have him come to campus. And so there was a lot of turmoil about it. And in the end, I just said, I am the descendant of slaves. If I can go and sit in a room and listen to him say those things, you can damn well do it too. And so he came, we had that event, and people had a chance to ask him questions and so forth. And that was it. It was it sort of disappeared after that. And that was helpful to me in preparing me for the slavery issue, because I learned eventually that in leadership, sometimes it really is all about you and who you are and what you value and what you represent, not in the moment when there's a crisis, but the rest of the time. And so I tried to do as Amy Gutman recommends in talking about how leaders should project their actions. And her point is that we shouldn't be, we should not be making decisions without revealing in the course of time the ways in which we are reacting and formulating our ideas. Mm. And so we should talk more about what we worry about what we find difficult and troubling. And the more we do that as leaders, the more people will understand that when our decisions emerge, they are a consequence of the agony of trying to work through the various aspects of a problem. So I tried doing that more as a consequence of the Horowitz affair. And so when the slavery issue came up, I decided we would get to the truth. And I appointed a commission, but as soon as I did that, the place went wild and people from all over the country really seemed to think I had lost my mind, including my friends.
Mm.
And the thing that was so remarkable about it is that everybody was very fearful about it. Not just people who thought they had something to lose if we called for reparations, but also Blacks. And so my Black friends were saying, you have lost your mind because you're going to make it impossible for any Black person to ever become a president again because of what you're doing. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Wrong. So anyway, I also remember in heated moments, our proclivity as academics to be complex and nuanced doesn't work. And so I learned to be very plain, very simple, and to look for the unimpeachable. And so in that regard, I simply said, when people ask, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? I always said, people have asked a question about our history. And I think we should tell the truth about that history, because if we lie as a university, how can you trust anything that we teach or anything that we do? And so universities should be about truth, and we will tell the truth no matter what it is. And I just kept saying that over and over and over again, and not trying to make it very complicated. And so we worked our way through it. And of course, the ridiculous thing is that since it was the worst possible thing that had ever happened, now hundreds of places have imitated it and so forth. So I don't know. I never would have thought that that would become the most famous thing I ever did. But certainly the issue of slavery and its aftermath has become still a very big issue. Last week I was at Georgetown University, which followed our study and did one of their own. And they've had a remarkable ongoing process involved with the Jesuits trying to disclose as much as they can about the history of the Catholic Church and slavery. And that work is still being uncovered. 2 weeks before, I was at LSU, and they're just starting their slavery project there. So it's going on, and before it's all done, there will be hundreds of universities and institutions that do this work based on the study that they did at Brown.
I have to ask, as a Smith alum and Smith faculty member who does work on race, did the question ever come up at Smith while you were here or
No.
subsequently?
It didn't.
Students, note to self. Tell us a little bit about, you retired, ostensibly, you went home to Texas to reunite with your family and in theory to rest. But instead you answered the call to become president of Prairie View. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience, which you just stepped down from last year, correct?
Yeah, well, I have never been a fan of the way that we categorize educational institutions. The so-called elite institutions, the not so elite institutions. And I have tried to make it a practice to move among educational institutions as a statement that I value education. I don't value the ratification of status. I value education itself. And so the reason I left Princeton to go to Spelman is because I wanted to show that the value of an African-American women's institution. And so when they approached me, I said, well, no, I'm retired, and I don't want to do that. But then they said, well, it's going to be a short time. And I looked at those students and I said, well, I value them as much as I value my students at Brown. Why would I say no if I had something to offer? And so I think I'm still very interested in breaking up this this really vile way in higher education that we allow others to do our work for us. Okay. And so we don't vet faculty. We look for proxies for vetting them. So where were they educated? Where are they coming from? If they're coming from a community college, doesn't matter how good their work is, they're not going to get an appointment at certain institutions, right? So we are best at vetting work, and yet we're lazy. We don't do that. We allow other factors to interfere with our ability to judge the ability of students and so forth. So I was on this tear when I was at Brown to get all of the Ivies to admit more community college students. And so I'd go to meetings and I'd, make my pitch and say how important it would be and so forth. But I mean, they finally come around to it more now. But it took a lot of doing to get them to say, yes, there are good students at community colleges and we ought to be admitting as many of them as we can. And so I think my feeling with HBCUs is that they are an incredible resource and have been for a long time in this country. They have not gotten their due by any means. And the way that I got involved with the Harvard project is when Harvard asked me to do the commencement speech, their commencement speech a few years ago. I put in my commencement speech that Harvard had benefited for centuries from the accrual of wealth, while HBCUs had almost often perished from the accrual of poverty, and that Harvard had an obligation as a part of the higher education community to care about what has happened with institutions that have not had the support they deserve. So I'm still running my mouth in the same way I did, years ago at Princeton. And there's always something I'm trying to fix. Yeah, and I guess that's why I can't retire.
Well, we appreciate it. I realize I have not given the audience an opportunity to ask any questions. Are there folks with a question that would like to come up to the mic? Because if so, we would welcome that. Do you want to come up to the mic, Allie? Do you mind? Yeah, can ask a question. I'm sorry, I've been hogging President Simmons all to myself. But.
So you've hinted a little bit throughout the questions about the different missions you've taken on, basically. But how would you say, in your tenure as an administrator has spanned decades, are there any challenges you'd say particularly changed over that period?
In the sense of having been ameliorated or what?
Just how would you say that some of the challenges look different now than they did when you started your career as an administrator?
Well, I mean, certainly, thank you for asking that. Certainly, don't you think that today women are in a much stronger position in universities than they were by far when I started out, and so I think that universities have dealt to some extent with the gender issue. I think it's not completely addressed because women are also under attack in this moment as leaders, and people are now trying to understand what that's all about. and where that's going to lead. But I do think that on the whole, women have found much better opportunities in higher education, both on the faculty and in administration than they had when I started. When I was just starting as a faculty member, I had an infant son at the time. And, the faculty meetings would be called and, I couldn't find a sitter and so forth. So I remember I took my son, I don't know if you've ever heard this story. I took my son as an infant into a faculty meeting. But I think that the challenges of parenting have been better addressed in the modern academy. I would say. I also think that there are certain kinds of things that simply don't exist at all anymore in the way people behave in the academy. And this will surprise you perhaps because of some of the things that recently you've heard people saying in regard to the Harvard situation. But it used to be a constant examples of harassment and aggression against people who were different in the academy. That was not at all unusual. I think that's abated significantly in spite of what you may see in certain high-profile instances. I think it's just a better environment. I think that I was meeting with a group of new faculty at Trinity University on Friday. And it was amazing to me to see them because they were all so different. One faculty member was wearing one orange sneaker and one green sneaker. This is the faculty, okay? And, in the days when you had to dress a certain way, you had to look a certain way, you had to be, you had to have certain social skills and so forth. It's completely different. You can be who you are fully. Even in conservative Texas, these faculty are expressing themselves in the way that they want to express themselves. And that is a really fantastic change from where it all started. Now, I can't tell you where things are going to go with the attacks on DEI and so forth, and our governor who is hell-bent on turning back the clock. But right now, it's an amazing thing to see what is possible on these campuses because things have changed.
And I think that's actually a perfect place to end. It is our time. I want to thank you again, President Simmons, for joining us. I want to thank you for this beautiful book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No,
Thank you
thank you.
again.
Thank you.